Ladies and gentlemen, mesdames, messieurs, welcome, good evening, welcome to the French Institute, welcome to Ciné Lumière, and welcome to the Night of Ideas. I'm Jason Solomons, I'm your compere for this evening, the Master of Ceremonies. An absolute pleasure to be here for another Night of Ideas. I think this is my third, it would have been my fourth, but as we all know what happened last year, and what a delight it is to come together for an evening where we talk about rebuilding together. That's the theme, our central idea of this Night of Ideas. We're going live around the world. We're on YouTube and we're on the other one, Facebook. And you are here live in the room, and it's a pleasure to see actual real people. And this hybrid edition, we've got used to that over the last 2 years or so. That's how it's going to be. But we've got some guests who are definitely here live with us, an evening of artists and philosophers, of writers and photographers, of poets, thinkers and politicians. We've got them here with us in the French Institute. We've got some of them joining us on screens. And together we'll debate about society, our role in it, our role in the world's role in us, and how we rebuild this slightly broken, slightly cracked world together. And we'll have ideas that come out tonight that may spring into mighty trees. They may be crazy ideas. They may be brilliant ideas. The idea is to share all of those ideas. They'll come tumbling out with our brilliant panelists and our hosts. So I'm here all evening introducing you, getting you in and out. We've also got a roving poet, a chorus, if you like, Anthony Naxaguru, who'll be giving us poems all the way through related to the themes of the panels. You've got them in your programs. It's going to be a very exciting evening. We've got so many guests to get through. It's time for me to introduce you to the man who's letting us be in his world, in the director of the French Institute. Would you please welcome Bertrand Buchwalter?
Merci beaucoup, Jason, et bonsoir à tous. Très heureux de vous accueillir ce soir ici à l'Institut français. Welcome. On behalf of the ambassador, Catherine Colonna, who sadly cannot be with us tonight because she's self-isolating, but I would like to welcome you all to the Institut Français for yet again another night of ideas. And like Jason just said, we are going to wander into lots of different themes tonight, lots of different topics, and tonight will be a night of debates, a night of entertainment as well, and a night of friendship where French, British, and European minds will come together. The Night of Ideas has been happening all over the world for a couple of years now. And this year, it's happening in 200 cities, in more than 75 countries. And it's being organized by French cultural institutions throughout the world. And we will be staging, and we are, as we speak, all over the world, staging debates and discussions on how we can rebuild our world together. Together is a very political word, maybe the most political word. But what does it mean? It means speaking to one another and respecting every respectful and respectable opinion. It means deciding collectively and give a voice to minorities while building a community. It means also shaping a better and more inclusive, more sustainable future. Tonight really will be turned towards the future, side by side with students and younger generations who also took part in the preparation of this edition. Tonight's edition of the Night of Ideas coincides with the French presidency of the Council of the European Union, and hence it will have a very strong European dimension. Here in London, it was curated in close partnership with the European Institute and the Faculty of Arts and Humanities of the University College of London and the Global Engagement Department of King's College. It is enriched with European voices thanks to the members of the European Union National Institutes for Culture, UNIC London, with the support of our friends from Austria, Cyprus, Germany, Italy, Slovenia, and Spain. It is enriched with the wonderful diversity of their respective points of view on how to reach a global solidarity, on how to build a more inclusive society, And our artists, engineers, architects, teachers, nurses will give shape to our future. It is supported by a unique global fund and organized with the help of the delegation of the European Union to the UK and the European Parliament's liaison office in the UK. I would like to express my warmest thanks to our sponsors, without whom this event would not have happened. The trust of the Friends of the French Institute and the Circle of France, the patron circle of the Institut, the CIC Banque Transatlantique, and the French Institut, l'Institut français à Paris. I would like to thank them for renewing their long-standing commitment side by side with us. I'd like to thank also Unique Global that I just mentioned, thank the delegation of the European Union to the UK, the European Parliament Liaison Office in the UK, and also the magazine Prospect for helping us promoting it. I'm myself a reader of Prospect, and it's a great magazine, and I strongly recommend you to check their stand in our entrance hall and to consider taking a subscription. They have put together a very interesting offer. I invite you as well to check the South Kensington Bookshop stand, which offers a wide range of our speakers' books. Last but not least, I should add that this event would not have been possible without my great team, which is led very effectively by Mathias Rambaud, the head of our book department. But really, it's a teamwork, and I would like to thank all the colleagues involved in the preparation of tonight's event. I would like also to thank the colleagues of the Higher Education and Research Department of the French Embassy, with whom we are teaming up, and La Maison Française d'Oxford. Let us acknowledge the scale of the transformation that await us. Let us be inspired by also our own experiences and those of our speakers. Je déclare ouverte la nuit des idées et très bonne soirée de débat avec nous ce soir. Merci à vous pour votre présence.
Merci Bertrand. Thank you, Bertrand. Ladies and gentlemen, as you heard from Bertrand, there is much to discuss this evening. There is also much technological feat to overcome. So let's hope we can get all of this right. Our first, as you heard, Catherine Colin, the ambassador, couldn't be tonight because she is isolating. Although COVID is officially over, Boris Johnson has said that, so it must be true. Congratulations to us, we've beaten it. But the Night of Ideas, we certainly will be beating that, but we'll be looking at how to recover from that. Certainly it will figure the pandemic, of course, in our discussions, because much has changed in the world. Someone who knows more about how the world has changed and our role as humans in it is anthropologist Philippe Descola, who should be, with a bit of luck, online with us now. Philippe, would you please deliver your opening address for la Nuit des Idées? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm sorry not to be in the flesh with you. I probably won't be the only one tonight. I hope the technology will hold on, at least for this short speech. The question we've been asked to dwell upon tonight at the French Institute is probably the most crucial that we will have to face during this century. How can we rebuild tomorrow's world together? In order to provide, if not a straightforward answer, at least lines of thought directed towards a grasp of the problem we confront, the best option is perhaps, in the manner of Descartes, to decompose each of the segments of the general interrogation into as many different yet interconnected questions. Obviously, the first question is, why do we need to rebuild the world? What happened to its present state that renders this task necessary, even urgent? What we need here is a diagnosis. The second question is more difficult because it is subtler. What does it mean to rebuild the world? Where do we find the components of this new world? And should we envision a master plan for building it, or rather look for many local solutions? And as a consequence, should the outcome be one world or a coexistence of many worlds, a pluriverse? What we need here is not only a clear grasp of the malfunctions of the present world, as in the preceding question, but also and foremost, a clear understanding of how new ways of being in the world might be favored, fostered, promoted. So the last question is closely connected to the preceding one. Who is the we who does the rebuilding? And to what kind of togetherness does it lead to? Is the we an abstract notion of humanity as a sort of corporate force? Or does it break down into a number of different and probably antagonistic political subjects? What is the degree of inclusiveness of together? Humans alone or non-humans of different kinds, whether plants, animals, artifacts, GMOs, viruses, glaciers, territories, etc. As you see, tonight's question brings about an overabundance of food for thought, and you should not blame me if I content myself in this short opening speech with barely sketching of the layout of the task before us. First question then, why does our present world need rebuilding? Why is it on the verge of becoming less inhabitable than it appeared to be a few decades ago? Well, we can at least identify two developments that led to this point. First, the anthropization of our planet has reached a tipping point through mechanisms that could hardly be foreseen not so long ago. Global warming, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, and the pollution of water, air, and soils. We might even regard recent human activities on an industrial scale as having become the dominant form of evolutionary pressure in the biosphere. Many observers use the word Anthropocene to qualify this new stage in the anthropization of Earth. The second development is that in the course of the past centuries, a tiny proportion of humanity has staked its claim to Earth resources, plundering the planet to secure its well-being. This minority has made life harder for the majority of its human and non-human neighbors. So it is not humanity in general that has brought about the Anthropocene. It is a particular system, a way of life, an ideology, a manner of making sense of the world and everything in it. These two developments require a moment of attention. What is this new stage in Earth history that we have taken to calling the Anthropocene? How does it differ from the idea of an ongoing anthropization of the planet, the effects of which can be detected as far back as the start of the Holocene? For we are now aware that even where human activity seems to have had little impact before European colonization, such as in the Amazon or in Australia, ecosystems were profoundly transformed over the course of the past 10,000 years by human management of the milieu with such practices as slash and burn horticulture, agroforestry, selective bushfires, etc. And yet the Anthropocene does not refer to this progressive wave of anthropization that has transformed ecosystems in many different ways. but to the climate-related consequences of human action and their feedback effects on conditions of life on Earth, notably a colossal loss of biodiversity. In other words, the Anthropocene proper is a very different phenomenon from the ongoing process of anthropization. The latter is the outcome of the long history of coevolution between humans and non-humans that has proceeded uninterrupted for the last 200,000 years. As it reshaped ecosystems, this process changed the planet, often in irreversible ways and with unforeseen regional effects. The Anthropocene, on the other hand, denotes a more global systemic effect resulting in a cumulative transformation of the Earth climate system, the consequences of which will be felt for centuries, perhaps millennia. It is thus reasonable to point to a much more recent beginning for this process, namely the Industrial Revolution around the 1800s. Defining the Anthropocene as a global systemic transformation that began a little over 200 years ago presents an advantage. It pinpoints responsibilities. The decision of the creators of the concept of Anthropocene, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer, to settle on the end of the 18th century as the start of this new geological epoch is felicitous because it cuts through the confusion surrounding the mysterious anthropos behind the Anthropocene. Neither global warming nor the sixth mass extinction is being driven by humankind as a whole. Whatever the effects of indigenous Amazonians or Australian Aborigines on the ecosystem they modified, they are not to blame for the rise in the concentration of atmospheric CO2, the acidification of the oceans, or the melting glaciers. The primary catalyst of the Anthropocene is the development of a particular mode of worlding, first in Western Europe and subsequently in other parts of the world, that emerged a few centuries ago. And this mode of worlding has been given various names depending on the aspects being called into questions, including capitalocene, thermodynamic revolution, technocene, modernity, or naturalism. What does this mode of worlding consist of? First, it is founded on the claim, unprecedented in the history of humankind, that there is a substantive difference between humans and non-humans, and not just a difference in degree. The distinction hinges on the claim that while humans share the same universal physical and chemical properties as all other organisms, we are set apart by our moral and cognitive dispositions. The result of this belief is the construction of a hypostasized nature from which human beings remove themselves. We observe this nature from a privileged vantage point, all the better to study it, and it is a good thing, and turn it to our advantage, and it might have dire consequences. This is the guiding principle of the ontology I called naturalism, which can be traced back to the scientific revolution in the 17th century. Upon this ontological foundation, a new relationship with nature and energy energy use was built. For thousands of years, agrarian societies relied on solar energy, that is the photosynthesis of many different plant species and their conversion into food, and on the kinetic energy provided by human and animal toil. So life centered around labor and land, resources that for a long time were inalienable. The emergence of market capitalism and the colonial, then imperial system that supported it meant that sources of energy, raw materials, manufactured goods could be diversified, as well as their convertibility ensured through money. This is when the great illusion of the last 2 centuries emerged. That is, the idea that nature is an infinite resource, allowing infinite growth based on infinite technological advances. What can be done? What can be done to deflect the dire consequences of these historical processes? Logically, global phenomena would seem to require a global response in order to mitigate their effects. That is, multilateral mechanisms such as the IPCC, the COP, and the IPBES. However, apart from the fact that these kinds of mechanisms tend to marginalize ordinary citizens and fail to produce startling results, most environmental changes happen at a different scale and so demand a different unit of analysis and a different scope of action. Symptoms of a generalized ecocide are felt more intensely at a local level, and it is there that they can be tackled effectively by the groups of humans and non-humans who are most directly affected. Though, of course, there is no question that climate change and species extinction are global phenomena from the perspective of the scientists who study them. But they take different forms for different human and non-human groups, depending on where they live and the means at their disposal to ward off some of its effects. However, as social scientist, I am an anthropologist, there is something we can do at a global level, inspired by the experience of communities we are familiar with the world over. And this is a fundamental rethinking of some of the processes that play a central role, both in the relationship between humans and in our relation as a species to the rest of non-humans. Foremost among them are the way we appropriate the milieu we live in and the way we incorporate them into the political sphere. Since the beginning of the enclosure movement in England, a relentless drive can be observed towards the transformation of an ever-growing portion of the world into goods that can be freely alienated. Pastures, arable land, forests, energy sources, water sources, the subsoil, genetic resources, indigenous knowledge and techniques, etc., etc. This process was based on a new idea, foreign to non-market economies, that things essential to the maintenance of life could be bought and sold, and on the assumption that these things should be regarded first and foremost as economic resources. So there is therefore an urgent need for a return to the primeval meaning and value of the commons, not as a resource to be exploited by all, but as parts of a shared habitat for which everyone should be responsible. Even more urgent is the need to expand our definition of the intangible elements that make up this collectively appropriated public realm, to encompass not only the material aspects, which I mentioned before, but also the climate, of course, biodiversity, of course, the atmosphere, knowledge, health, linguistic diversity, and protected environments. This requires rethinking our conventional understanding of appropriation as an act whereby an individual or a group assumes a right to use and consume parts of the natural world. Instead, we might consider an arrangement wherein the right holders are not humans or social groups, but ecosystems or systems of interactions between humans and non-humans. In such an arrangement, humans would be mere usufructuaries, or in some case, stewards. Appropriation, thus understood, would be the relationship of nature towards human beings and not the other way around. And this brings us to another concept in need of an overhaul: political representation. For it is urgent also to imagine a system of representation based not on individual entities, whether human beings, nation states, chimpanzees, or multinational corporation, but on ecosystems precisely. That is, on certain types of relationship between organisms in a given local setting, regardless of its scale or characteristics. This would include river basin, mountain ranges, towns, coastlines, neighborhoods, ecological sensitive areas, and so on and so forth. A true political ecology, a fully realized cosmopolitics, a politics of the world then, would go further than acknowledging certain intrinsic rights of nature without giving nature meaningful ways to exercise those rights. Rather, it would extend to converting ecosystems into political subjects, providers of rights for those, including humans, who inhabit them without greed. Such an arrangement would give real political expression to the idea that it is systems of relations rather than qualities invested in individuals that should form the basis of a new universalism of values. As trustees, humans would be no longer the source of rights legitimizing their own intemperate appropriation of nature. They would be the diverse representatives of myriad natures from which they had become legally inseverable. Such an idea strikes or may strike you as far-fetched when viewed from the perspective of our current legal and political system founded on individualism, which was born here in the United Kingdom in the 18th century with a handful of great philosophers. But there are plenty of examples in history and ethnology of groups in which the status of human beings is derived not from any presumed universal capabilities generic to us as a species, but from their implication in a specific assemblage, an indissoluble composite of territories, plants, mountains, animals, places, divinities, and many other entities beside, all constantly interacting with one another. In such systems, nature is not something that humans can possess, but something that possesses humans. So as you see, it's a very brief sketch of the task in front of us, but it's a very, very large task. And it will only be collectively unfolded by many of us. Thank you.
Merci, Philippe Descola. Thank you, Philippe Descola. Fantastic collection of books behind him. So we can take him very seriously with those. I hope you've read them all.
Most of them, yes.
Sure.
There are many more on the sides.
he's probably written half of them as well. So, merci. Thank you for your big idea to start us off with, Philippe. A big idea that many people will discuss, I think, through the evening. Do you have hope? Are you hopeful with your ideas?
I am hopeful because there's a number of younger people in different parts of the world, in Europe in particular, who are quite attuned to these kind of ideas. And there are some places, in France, for instance, they are called the ZAD, Zone à Défendre, where people are trying to build up different forms of living with the immediate environment by forsaking consumerism, private property, etc., etc. So I'm a great believer in the exemplarity of such experiences. It will take probably some time, but if people are aware that new conditions can be promoted, then nothing is completely lost.
Thank you very much indeed. Merci, Philippe Descola. Everybody, Philippe Descola.
Thank you.
Thank you. I should tell you, I'm Jason Solomons. I'm a film critic by trade. I host the podcast Seen Any Good Films Lately, on which my guests in the current edition are Joanna Agitoma and Khalil Jorej, whose film Memory Box played here at the weekend and was part of the warm-up night for the Night of Ideas. A brilliant film, brilliant podcast, obviously, but definitely a film to watch, Memory Box. I'm also film editor of the New European newspaper, so Think Without Borders, that's what I do. Brilliant to hear from Philippe. Ladies and gentlemen, we were going to have an artist with us tonight, Zineb Sedira, fantastic artist who is, Zineb Sedira, excuse me, who's representing France at the Biennale in Venice this year. But unfortunately, she's not well either. It's happening a lot at the moment, but she can't be with us. But we wish her well. She's here definitely in spirit. But we do have tonight, ladies and gentlemen, I mentioned a roving poet, a chorus, a poet who's given us original poetry to comment on each of the panels that we have. His name is Anthony Anaxagorou. I welcome him to the stage for his very first poem about the session that's coming next, Common Good for Common Ground. Anthony, welcome to the French Institute and the Nuit des Idées, the Night of Ideas. Anthony Anaxagorou, our poet, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, this one. Thank you very much. So, I've got two microphones. I'm going to read, so I've basically written poetry, like short poems, for each of the sessions. So I'm going to read two for this one to take up a bit of time. This one is Common Good for Common Ground. I stand singing on a crust of earth. Everywhere, white flames circle like the laughter of a king. I've seen them, what they do when the lights spin dry. I've heard them, what they say when they can. I've stood facing the better world, trying to reach out a palm, a solid word, to forge an agreement with the rough sleeper, younger than me. I've stood in the last century's waiting line, trying to correct the future. And when I stop to think about it, all I realize is this: I've wanted to help, to turn the tap on all the way, hold the door wide open. I've trained myself to live alongside a wet stone, a wounded pheasant, to ignore the moon when it lies. What else can I say other than this? Pay attention to the way we hit the ground, how hard it can be to get back up. From across the water, the sky is holding itself up like a plate. The archer packs down his bow. The developer logs off for good. And here we are, on a crust of earth. Everywhere is us, needing us more. Thanks. And this one is called More or Less. Evenings shoulder into the jasmine, fouler than a fatted cock. Each peony born to its station grows towards similar light. We write so well for our kind, license the lexicon of power like a tired bullet. Stand by for a pylon in snow. History's digital cache dilates. News gets crowned, our century's insomniac. You're struggling to backpedal, spinning all around the flush. I'll come clean. I can't stomach these tiny screens, 10-minute videos. Someone's about to get cancelled. You know where this is heading. Some never get to come back as I'm sorry. How do you look so authentic in reproach? Breath rich in hemoglobin, your smirk thick with lipids. You know some lives won't make it the full way. Tomorrow, bodies like my friends will be snuffed at a red light. At the bottom of your rhetoric, semantics cruel. I want to vandalize your speech, repurpose each syllable with a fairer way of shaping things. You sit, sharing a ready war, bickering over its color. You and I know the world is the last time for some who want life slowed. Every hashtag comes with a perfect set of holes, a cell. No matter the protest our actions become, we're still hauling suffering around like a state, surrounded by its metal dogs, who brand wounds to sell them on, no matter the language we arrive in, no matter how long it's been since. Thanks very much, everyone. Cheers.
Anthony Anaxaguru. Our poet. We have a poet with us all night. He's got lots more poems where that came from. Very exciting live poetry, I think, on the Night of Ideas. It's what artists do. They give us hope. We had the anthropologist there in Philippe. We've had the welcome from Bertrand. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of our opening session of the Night of Ideas. Many ideas have fizzed around already. We've got a panel coming in here next, Common Good for Common Ground. Anthony will be doing some more poetry. There's some brilliant panelists. If you've booked for that session, you can stay. If you haven't booked, you have to go because someone else will have come in your seat. So we've got about 10 minutes while we change the stage. And while you're listening, there'll be some children from next door, the school next door, will be delivering their thoughts in French about the future, about how we speak to one another, how we shape our future, and how we get out of this crisis and of this cinema, unless you've booked for the next session. See you in a minute. Bye.
que vous allez parler facilement à une personne qui est différente que vous?
Oui, je peux parler facilement à d'autres personnes. Par exemple, je parle à Sophie qui n'aime pas le foot. Et moi, j'aime beaucoup le foot. Alors, question 4. Quelle est la limite du décider ensemble? Alors ça, c'est une très bonne question. Et la réponse à cela, c'est malheureusement, si on décide tout le temps ensemble, on ne pourra plus être autonome et travailler tout seul. Ah, ça c'est très bien. Alors, on vous remercie de nous avoir écoutés et on espère que ça vous aura plu ce qu'on a dit. Et merci beaucoup. William Ward, mission internationale de l'eau. What has the unit of lockdown taught you? This pandemic taught me to hold on to my family and friends, to enjoy and appreciate little things because they can quickly disappear. What takes on the outside of human faith and the practice of substitution? Reckon firm past hypotheses, suggest the right to touch the arts. What I see this is the first question. This is what as we are offered a maximum of results, we don't need to stop first. Do you think it's possible to go back to life without God? We're not sure whether it will be the same as a result of life in another shape of life. Yes, that is the same life. If God cannot find this normal to work towards, at which point, because it means less catch diseases. Thanks so much. If you could change something from the past, if I could change something from the past, for example, empty stores buying everything even though it wasn't even necessary, and maybe you would recognize humanity instead of God. Shaping that future. Je pense qu'ils en ont un car il fait partie de la nouvelle génération et c'est celle qui va développer pendant la s'ils veulent avoir un planète jolie et propre, ça va devoir impliquer beaucoup de changements dans notre totalité, ingénieuse, parce que nous va devoir trouver un moyen de remplacer le plastique, les stress, etc. Pour résumer, si tu pouvais remonter dans le temps, en 10 ans, quel conseil aurais-tu donné aux humains de 2011? Les humains de 2011 auraient dû reconnaître que la pollution et le changement climatique étaient très graves avant que cela ne soit trop tard. Je leur dirais qu'ils doivent être plus prudents de ce qu'ils utilisent et qu'ils doivent être conscients que ces actes auront de grandes conséquences. Expliquer ces idées pourra améliorer le futur. Je pense que nous pouvons tout d'abord supprimer les éléments qui produisent le plus de pollution, comme les huiles. Je pense que nous pouvons également manger moins de viande et de poisson, car beaucoup d'entre nous mangeons plus de protéines que nous en avons besoin. Nous pouvons supprimer les voitures et construire plus de lignes de métro et de bus pour que l'on puisse aller partout dans la ville grâce au transport en commun qui pourra être électrique. Nous devons récolter de l'argent dans chaque ville pour que l'on puisse créer des champs d'éoliennes et des panneaux solaires. Nous pouvons dire que c'est hors la loi d'utiliser les produits chimiques pour la nature, comme les pesticides. Nous devons agir vite, le temps va passer vite et notre planète va mourir. Livre, Winston Churchill, 6e. Shaping our future. Explique les bonnes résolutions pour le monde d'après. La pollution, les inégalités, la pauvreté et beaucoup d'autres choses. Ces choses doivent changer. On doit faire des efforts pour améliorer notre monde. Le climat se réchauffe à cause de la pollution. Les animaux qui vivent aux endroits polaires n'ont plus de glace pour survivre. Nous détruisons leur habitat. La glace qui fond se transforme en inclinement des îles comme Venise. C'est maintenant que nous devons agir pour sauver ces animaux et notre planète. Nous pourrons prendre des sacs en tissu au lieu d'utiliser des sacs en plastique. Nous devrions toujours avoir une gourde réutilisable. Dans plein de pays du monde, les gens vivent dans la pauvreté. Certains n'ont même pas un toit au-dessus de leur tête ou un lit où dormir. Ce qu'on peut faire sont de petites actions pour aider les gens qui en ont besoin. On peut donner des choses dont on n'a plus besoin, comme des chaussettes, des écharpes, des bonnets. Nous pouvons aussi demander à notre école d'organiser des événements pour aider les sans-abri. Si tout le monde fait plein de petites actions, le moindre mouvement, comme ne pas mettre de carton dans la poubelle non recyclable, notre monde pourrait être un meilleur endroit. Nous sommes les élèves de 6e 1 au lycée Winston Churchill. Nous pensons que les enfants sont importants pour construire le monde et les enfants.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames, messieurs. Prenez vos places, s'il vous plaît. If you could take your seats, the nearest ones. We're about to start our next session. Welcome back. I'm Jason Solomons, if you weren't here at the opening session. I was. and I'm your host and compere for this Night of Ideas. Welcome wherever you are in the world, watching us on Facebook and YouTube, or here in the room in Kensington at the French Institute. Absolute pleasure to have you with us. This is our first panel tonight. The ideas have already started circulating. I can feel the buzz around the building and in this room in particular, and this is going to be an extremely fascinating panel. Common good for common ground. What is the common good these days in an era of individualism gone rampant? How do we bring it back together and find some common good? Well, the people tasked with that are with us in the room. Incidentally, by the way, Mariana Mazzucato, whose name you can see up there, she's got books downstairs for sale, South Kensington bookstore on table. She's got great, they look great, those books, they really do. But before you buy them, why not listen to her? So please welcome to the stage here at the French Institute our chair, Julian Limburg, Mariana Mazzucato, and remotely, Philippe Aiguillon, who should be appearing on the screen now. I leave the stage to Julian Limburg, ladies and gentlemen. There is Philippe. Julian, are you here? Brilliant. And Mariana, yes. My pleasure. Seats for you and your friends up there. See you in about 50 minutes.
All right. So welcome, everybody. I'm sure you can hear me, right? You can hear me well? All right. I mean, some of the introduction that I had planned was already done. So I have to say I'll keep it a bit shorter than initially intended. Welcome to this panel on common good for common ground, where we want to explore some of the questions that had already been touched upon. So what is actually, the purpose of creating common good, the old age question, how to produce common goods in an era of, in a new era of socioeconomic life, what kind of patterns and trends and maybe turning points with the pandemic can we observe in the creation of common goods. And we have two fantastic speakers here today. First, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, who's here with us in person. She's a professor in the economics of innovation and public value at UCL and founding director of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, and author of many, many influential books. The most recent one being Mission Economy, Moonshot Guide to Changing Capitalism. So, as was already indicated, if you have some room on your reading list for this spring, this might be a good idea. Sorry? Well, you got to plan. And then we have Philippe Aiguillon with us. Hello, Philippe. Who's a professor at the College of France, as well as Centennial Professor at the LSE here in London. And his work has really pioneered Schumpeterian growth paradigms, with his latest book also there, as you can see. The Power of Creative Destruction, very much in line with Schumpeterian terminology, I could say there. So there you go. And then there's, of course, me. My job is basically to fulfill the German stereotype in two ways. First is keeping track of the time. And second, no jokes. Now, the first one will be harder than the second one for me, but I'll give my best. So our plan for today is that we start with a short introductory statement round, first by Professor Mazzucato, then by Professor Aiguillon, where, they kind of elaborate a bit on this topic, on their ideas of common goods creation in the 21st century. And afterwards, there will be a more general discussion round, which I think there will be lots that we actually can discuss. Also followed by a Q&A. So if there are any questions, then please feel free to ask them. So without further ado, Professor Mazzucato, stage is yours.
Sure, great. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I don't know what your alternatives were in this wonderful festival, but thanks for choosing this one. So we each have 5 minutes, but I think neither of us have a watch or a stopwatch, so you'll tell us when to shut up. Do that. So I've just written this book that is actually kind of building on a long-standing thesis that I have, which is that we have completely under-theorized and in the process under-resourced, but especially under-imagined what the role of the public sector and the state could be in an economy that actually cares about social problems. And what's interesting is that when we have wars, somehow money comes out of the woodwork, and governments want to win wars, and they actually do things that are actually quite strategic. There's often an all-of-government approach, and no one kind of says, oh, sorry, there's no money, we're gonna have to penny pinch, and here's a bit of money to do that. You just kind of go for it, and you want to win. And what's weird is that we don't apply the similar amount of urgency, but especially strategic thinking and what I call the dynamic capabilities that are required within the state for all these other non-military problems that we have. And one thing I think we sometimes forget is that only about, God, what are we now, 2022? I keep forgetting what year we're in. So 7 years ago, the world, every single country, actually signed up to a list of 17 incredibly inspirational goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, that weren't handed down from the UN through some sort of bureaucrat. They were actually very much a process of kind of co-creation, negotiation, stakeholder consultation, and so on across the world. But the point is, every government, every state has actually signed up to them. And yet, I don't think we have the tools, the imagination, the framing, definitely from economics, to tackle them. And so this is an urgent problem. Like, either we should just take our names off, like take the signature off that list that have signed up to them, or let's get our acts together and do them. And the key kind of thesis that I have about that, and I think this might be something that Philippe and I, who's disappeared, I assume he'll come back at some point, might disagree with, because I think most of what we agree on is actually the interesting stuff. But maybe one of the disagreements might be is that I believe that economic theory is underprepared for this, because at best we think about the state as fixing market failures. So you're kind of always there filling the gap, too little, too late, of something that either has gone wrong or might go wrong. So even the concept of the public good, which is sort of up there when we think of the common good, in economics sounds good, because there's two words and one is good, but actually, if you look into the theory about it, it's really just correcting for something that the private sector is not doing. So public goods that have positive externalities, like basic research and development spending, which both Philippe and I have written about, because I've written a lot about the economics of innovation. The idea is that basic research produces these positive externalities, kind of spillover effects, great things, and so there's an underinvestment in basic research by private companies because it's hard to appropriate the knowledge just for yourself. So there's an underinvestment in it, so the state will come in and fund basic research. That's why I sound American. I'm not, I promise. I was born in Italy by Italian parents, but my father does nuclear fusion, and when I was 5, we moved to America because the US government, the Department of Energy, alongside Princeton University and many other universities, I grew up in Princeton, funds the basic research around nuclear fusion. So there's no debate about that. The opposite of that is negative externalities. When business does something bad, like pollution, the state has to come in to correct for that through something like the carbon tax. Or information asymmetries. Not enough funding goes to small, medium enterprises, state comes in, corrects for that. So my point is not that these market failures don't exist, but the problem is if the role of the state is just to come in and fix for one of these 4 different things, you're never gonna achieve transformational change. And what we need today is transformational change, radical change. We have economies that continue to be ultra-financialized. Large corporates have spent over $4 trillion, trillion, that's 12 zeros, just on buying back their shares, their stock prices, to boost the stock price, stock options, and executive pay. So this ultra-financialized form of corporate governance is a problem. We have a planet which is not sustainable. We have climate change, which, as Greta Thunberg tells us, we've just been blah, blah, blahing. We just have not been acting at speed on that problem. We have rising inequality in many parts of the world. So if we want to tackle these general problems, and especially the 17 concrete goals that we've signed up to, you can't just fix your way to it. So the idea of a common good approach, I think, is really useful to transform what is currently just a correction for something, so the public good is a correction for something that the private sector is not doing, to something we can actually do together as an objective. So turning a correction to an objective is what we need if we want to fight climate change, inequality, the digital divide, and so on. And I'll stop now because I'm sure I've gone over my 5 minutes, but what I talk about in the book is why that then requires a specific framing for economic policy, which has public purpose and the common good at the center of the design of the instruments we have, whether it's procurement policy, industrial strategy, innovation policy. And what I've done in the last kind of 5 to 6, 7 years is helped governments do that. And so I've helped the European Commission with this new concept of missions and mission-oriented innovation. So we begin with a challenge like Clean Oceans, SDG 14, turn it into a mission like get the plastic out in the next 5 years, 90% of the plastic, get as many different sectors involved. But to do that, you need to redesign your policy, for example, with conditionality. So we stop just handing out money to random sectors just to stay in place, but to transform themselves towards that goal. And for that, we need a common good approach.
Thank you very much.
Can you hear me?
Some very, very interesting points you made there, and I think we'll come back to them in the general discussion. But beforehand, we would like to listen to Professor Aguillon. We can see you now. Sometimes you disappear, but now you're here with us.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah? Okay. Thanks so much. Always, pleasure to listen to Mariana, and we have a lot in common, of course, and we might disagree on things, but I think it's always a pleasure. So I would just like, since I only have 5 minutes, to talk about one main theme of this book. So this book explains how creative destruction has been a fantastic engine of growth, but it has to be directed towards more inclusive, greener growth, towards really achieving social objectives, and how you can direct how the state and civil society together can direct creative destruction, the power of creative destruction towards achieving a more inclusive and a greener prosperity. And it's not just the state, it's the triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. That's the triangle that helps you achieve the goal. But I would like just to start the following way. Say, we had the pandemia. The pandemia, what it did is that it revealed weaknesses of capitalism which were different across countries worldwide. In the US, the pandemia showed the extent to which the US social model is broken. In fact, a number of people lost their jobs during COVID, and because they lost their jobs, they lost health insurance and they fell into poverty at the time where they needed support and health insurance. And so that was really whereas in Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, everybody gets health insurance throughout, and the poverty rate did not increase during COVID. So that really showed the weaknesses of the US social model. But at the same time, the pandemic showed the superiority of the US innovation model. Most of the vaccines, except AstraZeneca, but most of the vaccines came from the US. And it came because of BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, which is the kind exactly of things that Mariana has in mind. You do smart industrial policy to boost innovation, and you reconcile top-down industrial policy with bottom-up. You see money coming from the Ministry of Health, and then you elicit many projects, Moderna, Pfizer, Johnson, many other labs that you don't know about, that were there to turn RNA messenger technology in less than 1 year into mass production of vaccines. So that the US are much better at doing innovation. They have, well-funded universities. They have NIH, NSF, Howard Hughes Medical Institute. They have venture capital much more developed than we do in Europe. They have institutional investors much more than we have in Europe. They have the BARDA and the DARPA. They have a whole ecosystem of innovation. So given that US broken social model, but US better at innovation than Europe. So what is the dream capitalism that I have? I want a capitalist system that would be as innovative as the US, but as protective as Denmark and the Scandinavian countries, or at least most European countries. And some people believe, some of my colleagues, not Mariana, believes that if you choose to be innovative, it has to be at the expense of protection and inclusion. If you choose to be inclusive, it has to be at the expense of innovation. I believe this is rubbish. I think this is wrong. You can be both more innovative and more inclusive. Let me give you 3 examples, 3 policies that are exactly, as Mariana says, transformative, which make you both more innovative and more inclusive and protective. The first one is the flex security on the labor market. Denmark has invented a system. When you lose your job, for 2 years, you get 90% of your salary. The state helps you retrain and find a new job. And if you refuse more than 2 jobs, you lose your unemployment insurance. It's a fantastic system because it makes creative destruction work better. People lose their job, but they retrain and get into a new job. So it made the economy of Denmark more innovative, but at the same time, it made it more protective. When you lose your job in Denmark, as I explained in chapter 11 of my book, Power of Creative Destruction, of our book with my co-authors Céline Antonin and Simon Bunel, there is no negative effect on health, unlike in the US where you have the death of despair. So they found a system with a flex security, which makes creative destruction work better and also make the economy much more protective. The second example is education. We know that the probability of inventing depends on parental income, because we know that, those who have parents in the high income brackets, those are also parents that are more educated, and they transmit knowledge and aspirations to their children. But in fact, if you have a good schooling system, that can make this relationship disappear. If you have a good system, like in Finland, which is free and high quality for sufficiently long, then in fact, it doesn't matter whether your parents are high or low income. You will, through the schooling system, acquire the ability to become inventor. We have a problem in our countries of lost Einsteins. Many people could be innovators, but they cannot, in fact, because they are born to poor parents who does not transmit them the aspirations and the knowledge. So if you had an inclusive education system, high quality, it will make the economy more innovative because many more people will be able to be inventors, but also more inclusive because many more people can be part of the innovation process. So education is another example of a policy, if it's well done and well organized, that may make you both more innovative and more inclusive. And I end up now with the third one, which is competition. We know that there is secular stagnation in the US. We know that growth has declined in the US since the early 2000s. We know why. Because, in fact, you have superstar firms, Google, Amazon, Walmart, these firms, they have grown big with the IT revolution. At first, it boosted growth, but then they ended up becoming barriers to innovation for other non-superstar firms. They discouraged innovation by non-superstar firms. And the problem is that they could grow without any limit because there was no regulation of merger and acquisition in the US. They did not adapt competition policy to the digital era. They did not limit the ability of these firms to become totally hegemonic and inhibit innovation by other firms. Suppose now that you have good competition policy of the kind that Biden is trying to do nowadays in the US, okay? Then it will boost innovation because it will boost entry by all these non-superstar firms. They want to innovate, they want to come in. And at the same time, we know that when you boost entry, you boost social mobility and you make the economy more inclusive. So competition is yet another type of policy that makes you both more innovative and more inclusive. So I gave you 3 examples: flex security, education, competition, and that's not exhaustive. That can make your economy, I can become as innovative as the US and as protective as Denmark. And that's the kind of capitalism I would like to push for. And that will be achieved by the triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. Without civil society, you get nowhere. You need civil society to make sure that the state does the right thing and that the state takes transformative measures. So, sorry for being long. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think I would start to right there on the innovation part, because that I think is an issue that you both have done a lot of work on. And my question would kind of be, first, are there differences in innovation between countries? Because from the research area that I come from, it is often assumed that both those large welfare states, protective social security systems, they can have innovation, and those what we would call liberal market economies, so the US as well, just a different kind of innovation. With one being more incremental, specialized, and these big leaps forward in the US being more transformational. So is it possible to combine those two, actually?
So first, just to say something which I think is important during this health pandemic, where I'm currently chairing the World Health Organization's Council on the Economics of Health for All. It's only women, by the way, women economists. And when people ask me, and when people ask myself and Dr. Tedros, who's the head, why, we say, why the not? I won't swear in front of you. And so the vaccines, which Philippe talked about, there's currently about 6 or 8 of them. That's not the mission. The mission is vaccinate everyone globally. And currently we have vaccine apartheid, right? You have 80% of the vaccines being hoarded by 5 to 10% of the countries. That's not, you know, there's no point in innovating if people then don't have access to that innovation. So the access bit is really important, and that's where the US miserably fails, even for its own population. Philippe mentioned the National Institutes of Health. I wrote a book back in 2013, actually the early version was 2011, called The Entrepreneurial State, Debunking Public versus Private Sector Myths. And you know, everything in your iPhone that is smart and not stupid was publicly financed in the United States by the internet, DARPA, GPS, the Navy, touchscreen display, Siri, you know, so on and so forth. So the problem is, though, if you invest in that innovation through public and private, both of our books, I think, are both about public and private, and I'm really glad, Philippe, you mentioned civil society. The work I'm currently doing in Camden, part of London where I work in, is all about civil society. How do you get people to actually be co-designing these very missions in the first place? But what the US has done so miserably is it has things like the National Institutes of Health, which every year, it's publicly taxpayer funded, invest over $40 billion in health innovation, and the people that have financed that can't access it, a lot of them. So the prices of the drugs that are publicly financed or co-financed are so high, and they have no recognition of that collective intelligence that created them. And by the way, there's a law in the United States which in theory prevents that, because from 1980, before 1980, publicly financed research could not get privatized. It couldn't get patented. Since we had the Bayh-Dole Act in 1982, the idea was to get all this academic research to get commercialized, then we would allow, in the US, publicly financed research to get patented. And in the act, in the Bayh-Dole Act, it's a thick act, it says, well, surely the government will make sure the prices of the products that they finance are capped. It's called margin rights. The US government has never exercised its right, which is actually a legal right, to cap, you know, keep down the prices of the drugs that it has financed. So citizens ends up paying once, twice, 3 times, or in many cases in the US where there's no proper thing like the NHS, people actually die, not because they're sick, but because they can't afford the medicines. So it's barbaric. Rosa Luxemburg once said, socialism or barbarism. This is barbaric. Or the patent system. There's nothing wrong with patents. Patents, which both, you know, Philippe and I have studied, are there to incentivize innovation. But if you abuse patents, if they're too upstream, so the tools for research are patented, if they're too wide, so patents are used just for strategic reasons, or if they're too strong, hard to license, that nurtures value extraction and rent-seeking and monopoly power, not innovation that Schumpeter, you know, through his theory of creative destruction talked about. So the US is a failure, a miserable failure on the access side, and people die because of that failure. And during a health pandemic, when you have the Pfizers of the world, and Pfizer, I've been writing about Pfizer for 10 years, it's one of the most financialized companies alongside Exxon. And AstraZeneca has gotten such a bad reputation because of the whole procurement scandal, unfortunately. But what was really nice about AstraZeneca, and I'm not for saying good, bad, it's just interesting to study these things properly. AstraZeneca with Oxford University scientists who are publicly financed, because Oxford, unlike Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, is a public state university. Oxford and the UK government negotiated with AstraZeneca to make sure that the prices and the costs of the vaccine, you know, remain capped. And also the storage temperature was not too low, so it was accessible in the global south. And they signed up to what's called the patent pool to share the knowledge. Because during a health pandemic, you got to share as much of the knowledge so that you can have actually production in all parts of the world and imitation. And Pfizer didn't. And so I think we need to be really careful. It's not about the US innovation model. It has the Pfizers and the Johnson & Johnsons. What the US does have is a decentralized network of entrepreneurial state institutions like NSF, DARPA, BARDA, NIH. Again, I wrote about each and every one of these 10 years ago. And they work alongside the private sector, along the whole innovation chain, and it produces a lot of great products, including the internet. The problem is, what do we see today with the internet? It's been abused. All these big tech problems that we have around privacy, they could have been prevented ex ante if the funding for the innovation had some conditionalities attached to it, right? Instead, if you just see it as an innovation machine, creative destruction, public sector money, private sector money, without a market shaping process through which we make sure that these new technologies, whether it's health, climate, digital, and so on, we need to govern it not only ex post through some sort of redistribution program, but ex ante. And I think on that level, Europe is actually ahead of the game. So for example, the fact we have a GDPR kind of system which is thinking about privacy. And I think just looking, Philippe, at your book, and I'll shut up now, what's really important with creative destruction, which is on the title of your book, is that creative destruction is mainly about competition. Most of the innovation stuff that Schumpeter wrote about, Marx had already written about it. What was original in Schumpeter was his theory of competition. And I think what we need today, and I think Europe is getting there quicker, and Lina Khan is quite interesting in the US, she runs the FTC, but in Europe, I think what we need, and what we're seeing starting to happen for the first time, so we're sort of ahead of the game, is merging the thinking around innovation policy and competition policy. These can't be separate. So in the case of big tech, we need to go after the algorithms. You can't wait for big tech, which by the way, we shouldn't call big tech, because they're actually media companies and they should be regulated as such. Most of the tech was financed elsewhere. But we need to think about, in the early stage, how these algorithms are designed in the first place to make sure they're not harmful. Currently, what we have is a lot of money is thrown at technology, and then after the fact, a whole other set of people who don't even understand the technology, have no clue, try to regulate it. And I think this is the most urgent thing today, and interestingly, Europe is ahead of the US on this.
Maybe I can say a word on that.
Yes, please.
So first, I mean, there is no such thing as a Schumpeter theory of creative destruction. Schumpeter introduced the notion of creative destruction. There was no theory. I mean, when I studied growth economics, there was no such thing as a Schumpeterian model. We developed the model with Peter Howitt, and then we had the successor. So there was no theory. And on competition and innovation, Schumpeter had very confused ideas. And I spent 10 years of my life looking at the relationship. I think you can very well reconcile, as Mariana may be suggesting, competition policy and industrial policy. But the problem is that competition policy in Europe is not yet well done. We are obsessed by market share and market definition, and we should do more looking at whether a merger and acquisition inhibits future entry and future innovation. So we have to transform competition policy. It's too much inward-looking competition policy in Europe. It was just to make sure that countries would collaborate within Europe. It was more an integration policy and not truly a competition policy. We need to reform competition policy in Europe to be more outward-looking. We compete with the US and China. We don't just compete among ourselves. So we have to reform competition policy. We have to have an industrial policy, much like DARPA. We don't have the equivalent of DARPA and BARDA in Europe. We have embryos, but we are very far from it. And I think if we have good industrial policy and reformed competition policy, then we can reconcile the two and have really very operational competition policy together with modernized industrial policy. I think that's a huge challenge in Europe. I wanted to say just one word on the thing. Mariana is right. The big problem is diffusion. When there is always the trade-off, which is very much at the heart of Schumpeterian economics. You need to reward inventors. If you don't reward them, they won't invent, they won't innovate. But at the same time, you would like to diffuse innovation, like vaccines or clean technologies to less developed countries that cannot afford them. And there, my colleague Michael Kramer, in '96, who got the Nobel Prize, Michael, 2 years ago, with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, Michael had the idea that the state or community of states could repurchase innovations or inventions from inventors with a certain social markup, and then they could diffuse them. So you could imagine a role for a community of states, it could be the G20 or others, to have the role that Michael Kramer recommended, to repurchase innovations so that to diffuse them. That would allow you to both compensate inventors so that they still have incentive to invent, but still worry about the diffusion. I think that cannot be done by one country alone. It has to be done by a community of countries. You could imagine joint sovereign wealth funds or things like that that could be activated for that purpose.
Thank you very much. I would have a follow-up question. Why don't we see more of it? Why don't we see bolder policies in order to take on some of the issues that you've been talking about? What might be obstacles and how to overcome them?
One of the first chapters in my new book, I look at the massive outsourcing that's happened from government capacity over the years. So McKinsey, PwC, Deloitte's no longer just advising, but in many cases kind of running government programs, because government itself, often for ideological reasons, but actually it's become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So since basically the 1980s, it kind of coincides with the corporate governance stuff I was talking about before in terms of just maximizing shareholder value. But in some ways, the kind of very I don't like the word neoliberal, but let me just use it now because it kind of sums up the point. Neoliberal economics had, a spillover into the public sector in terms of what we thought it was for. And the way that civil servants were actually being trained and continue to be trained through public choice theory, new public management, these words probably mean nothing to you, but this idea that at best you're there to fix market failures, actually, at best, at worst, just government, do as little as you can, then get out of the way. That had an effect on the training, the investment within what I called before the brains of government. So part of it is a capacity and a capability issue. If government stops investing in itself to be dynamic, to think out of the box, to be flexible, to be agile, it's going to be in trouble. And in my Moonshot book, I look at how we got to the moon. It wasn't just NASA. It was, obviously it was government run, the whole Kennedy thing of we're going to do this because it's hard, not because it's easy. But there was huge amounts of companies involved in many different sectors, nutrition, electronics, the whole software industry was an outcome of that. But the relationship between public and private was very ambitious. NASA was confident. They even had a no excess profits clause. Not no profits. You don't get to the moon with charity. You also don't solve COVID with charity. Charity is there to kind of fill the boxes when we don't have proper business and proper government. They changed how they did procurement. The first thing they did was to change procurement, which is government purchasing programs, away from this kind of static, boring cost plus mechanism. They transformed it to a fixed price, like a prize scheme system, but with constant incentives for quality improvement and innovation. So you got more if you were really innovative. So they took care to design the relationship between business and government because the problem was hard. Getting to the moon and back in a generation, and they did it even sooner than they thought they would. And they had no clue how to do it in the beginning. They literally were bluffing when Kennedy gave his speech. And so the desire to experiment, to welcome risk-taking, to kind of have a process that could deal with uncertainty. After the Apollo 1 fire, one of the 3 astronauts who died yelled that day, he's like, how the fuck are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because he couldn't hear what was being said to him in the mission control room. And the first thing they did was change how NASA was organized to be much more flexible, agile, with project managers who would have teams delegated but in constant communication with each other. Whereas today, when something doesn't work in government, we're just like, oh, it's so bureaucratic. But we need bureaucracies. We just have the wrong bureaucracies. We don't have dynamic, creative bureaucracies. So what NASA did was change its bureaucracy because the problem was so hard. And so if we don't invest in changing our bureaucracies to be agile, flexible, if we don't have proper symbiotic and mutualistic partnerships with business and stick with these parasitic predator-prey partnerships, strong word, in the health sector and some other sectors, we can't solve these problems. And so I think it's ideology and lack of investment, but the lack of investment is not by chance. It's as a result of this really problematic framing that we have. So we don't have the kind of dynamism that we have in business schools when they think about the private sector for government.
So reinventing Weber to a certain extent as well with bureaucracies, right? Professor Aguillon, would you like to touch upon these points regarding potential potential breaks to the kind of policies that could really that you promote?
I think some breaks are, very much, that you have vested interest that block that's also very much in the spirit of the model, kind of model we work, is that, with growth, you have emergence of big conglomerates, big firms, and those big firms, they lobby and they put pressure on governments to prevent them from moving. You see, for example, the competition, that's where the civil society is important, because just the state would not do the job. The state would not do the job because the state can be captured by private interest. And that's where you need civil society. You see, you got the change in the US because Biden was elected, and then he could try to implement a new competition policy. I don't know if they will succeed, by the way. So you see, the problem is very much that, we might know what to do, but the problem is that you have vested interests that are very powerful to lobby governments to maintain their power, you see? And that's why it takes civil society to really, to really try to break or diminish the power of these vested interests, to get the chances to go on. We know the secular stagnation, as I said, in the US is very much due to these superstar firms and the fact that there is no barrier to their expanding. And you need to do something about it. But of course, they had enormous lobbying power. And similarly on environment, the lobby of the oil lobby in the US or elsewhere, in France, elsewhere, is huge. And so it's very hard to, and that's where you need really to have the civil society there to reduce the power of these big conglomerates, to make sure that this, that creative destruction can really take place, that you can have new entrants, new actors that come with new views that will change things. I think that's a big part of that's what blocks things very often. You see, the change is often blocked by vested interest. You see, in Japan, for example, why is Japan grew very fast between 1945 and the late 80s and then stopped growing? Because during the catching up phase of Japan, you had these big conglomerates called the keiretsus, and the keiretsus block everything. Not only they block entry on their market, but they block any change in government policy that would make a Japanese economy more competitive. And you see, that's something you come across all the time. Yeah.
Can I just
Yes, please.
add something? So I think Philippe's completely right, but let's not forget civil society sometimes is part of the problem. Like, it's nice to say the people, but sometimes the people, look at...
You can have populism. You can have populism. Absolutely. I agree with that.
But I think your point is still a valid one. However, I think even if we had civil society and processes for civil society to kind of disrupt these incumbency effects, you still need metrics within public institutions to hold them to account. So I've become very interested, for example, in the BBC, which is, by the way, under massive attack. There's a war against the BBC that everyone should look into. I've written a bit about this. But anyway, the BBC has within its organization a metric around public value. And it's a concept, coming back to the title of this session, what is it, common good for common ground? For common good for common ground needs better metrics. It's not going to be a cost-benefit analysis or a net present value calculation that's going to get us the common good. And what's interesting about the BBC, if we compare it to, say, PBS, Public Broadcasting Service in the US, which is very good, I'm sure for those of you who are either American or have been to America, you'll have watched, on Channel 13 or whatever channels, really good programs. But it's a very small station or program. It does the classic market failure thing. It does high-quality documentaries and news. High-quality news, whereas BBC has done everything. They do soap operas, EastEnders, but it's a soap opera about the working class, not like Dallas and Dynasty for those of you who are of a certain age and memory. Soap operas about the rich. They did talk shows. So is that bad? Is that good? Why were they doing things that maybe business does too? Because they had a metric within the BBC of public value. So if you're going to do soap operas, you're going to transform them and bring diversity to the screen. Or talk shows, you're going to get people actually talking about really kind of difficult issues that can expand our tolerance and our understanding of the other. And so what's interesting is the BBC has that, but so many other public organizations don't have that. And if you have that, it kind of holds you to account. So civil society can hold you to account, but what we need is also internal kind of evaluation exercises that tell you when you're going down the wrong path. Because otherwise you might just, even if you're doing the SDGs, it might feel good because you're talking about climate change, but if you don't have intra-organizational metrics that give you a sense if you're going down the wrong path. And unfortunately, this is what I meant in the beginning, we've under-theorized those things. We have really poor and static and boring and not very good metrics to hold government to account.
You remember, by the way, talking about the BBC, you remember under which pressure they were during the Iraq War when they got against Tony Blair. And you remember all the turmoil there was at the BBC at that time. They were subject to big pressure to not say that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. You remember that time?
Yeah, or with Brexit, literally every time I went on the BBC, they had to put someone against me, and they would take the random idiot off the street just because they had to, you know,
of course,
literally like zero. I think one of the other panels here is about expertise.
But you see, for example, in the US, a big problem in the US is that, you know, the lobbying is a huge problem. I mean, my friends, Francesco Trebi and, you know, Bombardini, you see the big problem in the US is that, you know, you had this Supreme Court act that, you know, private firms could finance politicians and during campaigns with no limits. That's dramatic because it gives enormous power to vested interest. We know, for example, in Europe, we much more regulate the financing of political campaigns. That's the kind of thing. So competition policy is very important in itself. But if you have competition policy in a country where incumbents can finance political campaigns without any limit, anyway, you know that it's doomed. I mean, you have, you see, you can have the best competition policy, but it's somehow thwarted, you know, is counteracted by this very unequal game between incumbents and potential entrants.
Yeah, thank you very much. Some very, very interesting points. And at this stage, I would actually like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions. So if there are any questions, please raise your hand. Blind, I have to say.
First of all, thank you for the intervention. It's very interesting to have your input on this topic. So I have a question about the common good. So you're both economists. On the last year, I worked on European citizenship campaign. It's called Stop Global Warming. I don't know if you heard about it. It was led by a fellow Italian, Marco Pappato, a former European MP. And the idea is, it was obviously to shift the tax from labor to tax carbon. So to put a price on pollution, on use this revenue to transform the economy to become to make Europe more green. And obviously using as well this revenue to help low-income families. Otherwise, you have the yellow vest, like in France. So it's all the economists, I think 99% of the economists do agree that carbon pricing is the best tool to fight climate change. And this campaign was inclusive. It was to help everybody. So why it didn't work? Yeah. Because they did everything. They had you know, movie stars helping them in Italy, rappers, models. Didn't work.
Can I just say a word, because on Yellow Vest, it's my country, we are fellow citizens. I mean, I believe in carbon tax. Of course, we know green innovation is the way out. We know that negative growth is not the way to solve the climate problem. We don't want to go back to prior to the Industrial Revolution, or to be permanently in the first lockdown, which would be the negative growth way to fight climate change. We know all the, the side damage that the first lockdown induced, among the young and all that. So we need green innovation. We know that firms do not spontaneously innovate green. Firms that innovated in dirty technology in the past, they will tend to keep innovating in dirty technology in the future, unless there is state and civil society intervention. So the state, of course, can use the carbon tax. But the problem with the carbon tax, we know, it's in fact very complicated if you want to compensate, people who are poorer or who live in suburban areas and all that. So behind the simplicity of the carbon tax, there is a huge complication. We call that usine à gaz in French. So carbon tax is one tool, but it's very complicated if you want to avoid the yellow vest movement. The other thing is subsidy to green R&D. industrial policy green. You know, the nuclear fusion and finance, what Mariana's father does. Very important. Manage the energy transition. Build nuclear plants, well, you know, to some extent, at least for a while. I think those all are tools, but there is also, those are the things that the state can do, but civil society can do also. And we explain in our book that in places where consumers, consumers can use the name and shame. They can say, look, this product, you know, this firm produces, you know, dirty or uses dirty inputs. And the name and shame, particularly in a more competitive environment, can be equivalent to a huge increase in carbon price. So it's very interesting that the combination of information by the consumers of the CO2 content of products combined with competition between firms, this combination is as important as an increase in carbon price, which is 3 times what provoked the Yellow Vest movement. So you see, again, there is my triangle between firms that innovate, the state that can use carbon tax, industrial policy, subsidy to clean R&D, and the civil society through the name and shame that can also be a huge force to induce green innovation. I think that, again, this triangle is crucial to try and achieve greener growth.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, you didn't say the word, but the just transition movement, which is really being proposed by people like Sharon Barrows, who's the head of the international kind of labor movement or organization. That idea, I think, is really important, but one of the problems is who's even defining the transition? Like, if it's just a bunch of, you know, elites like me and Philippe and some businesses, you know, Paul Polman and Davos and so on. So there's something about making sure not only that we're investing in workers, for example, so they can adapt to the transition, but even those conversations in the beginning of what does it even mean to live together in a more sustainable way? What is green? There's something about bringing that citizen participation that Philippe has been talking about. Yeah. And this is what I found so interesting in Camden, again, the part of London where I live, where the Camden Renewal Commission that I co-chair with Georgia Gould, who's the Camden Council leader, we've tried to, for example, bring resident associations, civic assemblies or citizen assemblies to the table. Instead of just saying, retrofit your buildings, this is going to be great on the housing estates, we bring the resident associations early on, even just to debate, what does all this stuff mean, the sustainable growth path, and how do you want to live in a more sustainable way? Or during COVID-19 with all these food banks that appeared, and in Camden, all over London, there was poverty all over the world, as you know, people had a very hard time at work, but also the lockdown experience. What does it mean to transform a food bank to a food cooperative? So you give agency to people. It's not just about, you know, civic society. How do you give power in the decision making? And I think so many people, especially in the workers' movements, just don't trust a lot of what's been happening even around green. And they're right, because what happened in the previous revolution, before the green revolution, the IT revolution, we've seen how that's gone. You know, the profits have been very skewed. The benefits have been very skewed. And even though, of course, it's brought great progress, we shouldn't be, you know, nihilistic about it. There's something about, and I mentioned before the word conditionality, like there's contracts, right? Like we need to make sure that the benefits of all these things, whether it's a green revolution, IT revolution, and so on, are properly distributed. And one really interesting thing that happened in Germany is like the steel industry. No one talks about these boring industries like cement and steel, but steel everywhere is begging to be bailed out. And in Germany, because they have a kind of this very clear Energiewende policy, which is not perfect, but anyway, they have it. The way that the government has given money to steel has been conditional on the steel sector lowering its material content, which they've done through repurpose, reuse, recycle technology through their whole value chain, not because they went to the World Economic Forum to talk about, you know, purpose, but because they had to get €1 out of government. So imagine conditionalities linked to sectors that they have to invest in worker training, better working conditions, better wages, a green transition, you know, stop doing share buybacks and so on. So it's not about the state versus business, it's that place where the state and business interact. We need to be super ambitious on that. And unfortunately, labor unions don't talk enough about that, right? It's about how do you get an industrial strategy and innovation policy with conditions attached that make sure that there's investment towards people, making people's lives better. And lastly, another thing we never talk about, the profit share of global income is at a record level. You know, GDP can be broken up by income in different ways. The profit share is at a record level. The labor share is at a record low. That is not because capital has become super intelligent and labor has become stupid. There's been a huge capture of the returns. And, you know, these issues that we're talking about, civic engagement, conditionality, and so on, has to ultimately end up in a more distributed benefits of all this great technology that Philippe and I write about.
Thank you very much. We have time for one very short further question, if there's one. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Just, Mariana, sorry, you mentioned at the beginning the Paris COP in 2015 and the date statements. What is your view on the COP 26 that happened in November in Glasgow? Are you more optimistic? And it seems to me that in Glasgow there was many more companies present. So in the past it was much more political, and Philippe talked about the civil society, which could be represented by Greta Thunberg. Do you think that the fact that the corporate, the private sector was more present in Glasgow is finally filling the triangle, and we're finally going to get more efficient on tackling climate change?
I mean, I think there's been a combinations of things that have happened this year, which makes me, I don't want to say optimistic, but it's progress, right? Like, we shouldn't just complain that everything's crap. There's actually a lot of really good things. So both the G7 agreement on taxation was a positive thing, but also with COP26, Mark Carney and his colleagues who've really been pushing for particular ways to help finance flow to companies that are truly green and kind of having these ESG metrics, much more ambitious. I think all these things, and I mean, that did happen at COP. It was a big feature of COP, the kind of financial reforms towards a green transition. The problem is it's not mandatory. We wouldn't wear seatbelts, would we, if we weren't fined? I mean, in Italy, it was so incredible when the smoking ban came in. Literally, people stopped smoking almost the day after in restaurants. I was shocked because nothing like that happens in Italy, but that's because there was a fine. You were fined. People still in Italy now drive and park on zebra crossings because there's no fine. So with climate, unless there's like mandatory rules, they're transparent, and we systematize and standardize them globally, we're not going to have the change that we need, and definitely not the change at pace, because we have like 7 years left until global warming is irreversible. So the urgency and the speed that's needed is like nothing we've ever experienced. And unless we make these things rules, and both the reporting structures for companies, but also the financial flows, but also governments. So during COVID-19, 56% of the COVID-19 recovery funds that went to energy projects went to fossil fuel companies. And in 2019, Europe still spent 56 billion on subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. That is hardly moving at pace. So until we actually outlaw that kind of stuff, it's just not going to change at the speed at which we need. So yeah, some good stuff, but not at the speed that we need and not with the rules that we need. And we don't change, unfortunately, until there's rules.
Thank you very much. Oh yeah, please. Thanks so much, Professor Mazzucato, Professor Aguillon, for a fascinating debate. Unfortunately, we already run out of time by now. So, but the debate will, of course, continue here afterwards with a panel on what's essential, Tales from Lockdown. Thank you very much for participating, and have a good evening.